Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning into the Liberty Report. With me today is Chris Rossini, the co-host. And Chris, welcome to the program.
Good morning, Dr. Paul.
Very good. Chris, I think most everybody heard in the news about what happened in Chicago last weekend, but it was sort of a report of the war zone, what were the casualties, and the casualties were a little bit frightening. We know there's a problem in the inner cities, and Chicago's not the only city facing these problems. There's even problems of people sleeping in the streets in San Francisco and L.A. and Washington, D.C. and New York City, and the violence is there. Detroit gives us, they're involved with a lot of violence too. But this weekend it was Chicago. They got the attention because it was like a war zone. There were 74 shootings and 12 people killed. The emergency rooms were overrun. And you say, well, where were the police? Did anybody get arrested? No, they stayed out of town. They didn't like the atmosphere, and the people don't like the police, and they blame them for part of the problem. So the police weren't there. There were no, under my understanding, there were no arrests, no charges for all this violence. But this has been around for a while, and I thought today, Chris, we ought to talk about this because there's a lot of different problems, everything from, families, the breaking up of the families, and no two parents at home. But there's also some economic, social problems that is a reflection of some bad government policies. So I want to touch on that. It's a mess, and we'd like to sort it out. We don't have a magic wand to solve all these problems. For instance, if the family breakup is a major part of the problem, there's somebody other than us can fix that. But we can deal with the society, the social atmosphere that results from government programs and government involvements and government law enforcement. So there's a lot here that governments can have caused the trouble. And right now, it's sort of like what the socialist candidates are running for. The worse things get, the more socialism they want. That's what they've done in Zimbabwe. They don't say, maybe it's government too much involved. Maybe they participate in that. Maybe we need less of it. They get more of it. And I just hope that we don't slip into that. But there's hints of that in this country that we may go in that direction. But I'm sure you saw this news, Chris, and you may have an opinion or two on what we might do about it.
Yes, and the first point I wanted to make is because we ask in our title, who's at fault? Obviously, the person committing the crime is at fault, but we want to talk about how there are bigger forces at play that create this type of environment. Now, the first knee-jerk reaction that people are taught is to blame the weapon. Oh, it must be the guns. The inanimate, unconscious weapon is to blame. And, obviously that's not the case. It's never the gun, the knife, the baseball bat, the crowbar, or the fist that is, it's always the person's choice to commit violence. In fact, with guns, the more restrictions that have been placed on guns, ironically, the more violence we've had. Walter Williams pointed out once that in most of America's early history, a person could walk into a hardware store or department store and get a gun. And he said in 1902, the Sears mail order catalog had 35 pages of firearm advertisements. So getting a gun was much easier than it is today, yet violence is much more today.
So it is much more complex. There was a statistic that came out as a result of this shooting that generally speaking in Chicago, if there are 20 shootings, if they identify, there's only one chance out of 20 that anybody's going to get prosecuted. So the whole system has totally fallen apart, and nobody will report, even if they know who shot the individual, they will not report it because it means that maybe a death sentence for him. Because the one replacement for the family has been the gangs. People like to have some group to identify with, and families in the old days used to be a pretty good group to identify with, and it still is for a lot of people. But under these circumstances, it isn't. But what they resort to are identifying with gangs, and gangs fight with each other, and they're very competitive. And this is an example of of a problem that has been created very much by government, because just as you pointed out, guns were available before, so it wasn't the lack of gun laws that was the problem. I mean, the guns didn't do it. But it's been the drug law that has contributed to this. It's added to the fuel to the fire, because people, end up, poverty is a big thing, and economic policy is important, but people resort, belonging to a gang, to get their funds that they need. That's how they earn their money, So there's profit in it. So the drug war has been a disaster for the inner cities, and it creates the gang mentality. And this I think some of this will never be solved. Some of our problems at the borders of our country is very much involved with drug dealers. And yet at that period of time that you talked about, that Walter Williams wrote about back then, it was way before the major war on drugs started. Most people think the modern day war on drugs was the early 1970s by Richard Nixon. And so back in World War II and before that, I remember working in a drugstore when I was 12 years old, and I could sell, codeine over the counter and cough medicine, and nobody did anything about it. I never remember anybody, buying this cough syrup to get high. So the atmosphere is different, and but I think the war on drugs has been a major contributing factor to the problems that we have seen occurring in the inner city.
Yes, in our history, if only people would have learned from alcohol prohibition. We already went through this, and it was the same thing in the 1920s and 30s. There was violence as a result of it, and people dying from drinking alcohol off of the streets. They were dying just like people take drugs and are dying from bad drugs, because there's no accountability. What, are you going to go sue the drug dealer? But whenever government prohibits people from doing non-violent things, they create a criminal industry. And after time goes by, the criminals don't want it to go away. Do you think drug dealers and drug cartels want an end to the war on drugs? Absolutely not. So it's another example of government creating more problems by trying to solve one.
And the conflict between the people of the inner city, because there are, I'm sure, still quite a few there that would like to avoid the violence and try to steer away from it, but and they can't even get the police to come in, because the police are frightened about coming in, and they're told to stay out frequently. But also there's a problem that we've talked about on this program, and that's the militarization of the police. They overreact and they get themselves into trouble, even though what is needed in there is a little bit of a police activity to maybe calm the situation down. But it's what's least likely to happen. There will not be, and the people aren't allowed to own guns, so they can't defend themselves. But between 2010 and 2017, the city of Chicago had to borrow over $700 million to pay for offenses of overreaction by the police. So the police overreact probably for various reasons, that they do this, because there's probably some tough situation. But we do know, especially because the high-profile cases get on TV, and it looks like innocent people getting shot in the back. And although I'm sure this is more rare than common, but it's still a major issue. These SWAT teams. Just a total violation of people's rights. So they not have the right, relationship with communities like this. So I don't think that's going to be the solution. That's been the talk. The mayor's at fault. He should get some blame, because he was part of the liberalization of all these social things. But they say, well, we're going to get more police. We're going to get more police. We'll get the federal government to send in the troops. All these kind of things of just sending more. And that still isn't addressing some of the fundamental factors and problems that come with poverty. And I think this is major. We live in an age right now where there's tremendous wealth. The stock market is skyrocketing, and the rich are getting richer, and there is a really growing descent between the two ends of the economic system, the very wealthy and the very poor. And of course, if you add into this the philosophical support for the people who want to claim demands because they are victims, believe me, you can get it from the universities, and Walter Williams has been very good on this, explaining all the crazy nonsense coming out of colleges. So these individuals who are having trouble, they're not saying, well, I have to bend the rules a little bit, I might as well steal a little here, I don't want to. No. They're justified by it. They have a right to do this. Rights are what they demand and need because they've been cheated and they're victims. And they've been victims for hundreds of years, so therefore they have an obligation to go out and take what they want. But the philosophic positions of this are defended and preached by our professors, as well as their movement, because most of them support the cultural Marxism, which is part of this. And this is an environment of violence. That you get things by violence. I just think, Chris, this is exactly opposite of the premise of libertarianism, because what we believe is that if no individual ever had the right to initiate violence against another person, it'd be a pretty peaceful world. And yet now we have a society that generally says, yes, you have to, because it's your right and your duty, otherwise you'll be run over. So they take a position exactly opposite of the libertarian position. Matter of fact, it's a position that's opposite of Martin Luther King, because he felt that people were mistreated, but he didn't preach violence. As a matter of fact, he was anti-violent. Matter of fact, I believe Martin Luther King was killed because he was against the Vietnam War. So he was a non-violent person in that regard. But I'll tell you what, it's different now. That doesn't mean that it's not out there and that the libertarian message is dead and gone, but a lot of it hasn't been exposed. I think the message out of our universities and our professors is filtered, through the media and movies and all these things and television. At the same time, there is no evidence that they even repeat anything that we believe in. But I still think our message is out there. It needs to be offered. I think still, in spite of these horrible stories and statistics, I still think if you went out there, even in the inner cities of Chicago, I would think that there's a large majority aren't violent gang members. I think they are a minority, but they are, operating under the conditions that are set so often by our government, whether it has to do with the police and drug wars and an economic system. Chris, we've talked a lot about why the middle class gets wiped out, and it was expected. They really do get impoverished, and they're taught to believe, well, we don't get enough government help, so we have to get the government to steal more for us. If they don't steal enough, we have to go ahead and steal this. So we have a philosophic challenge on this as well to get our message out, which is a nonviolent message of what liberty and peace is all about.
Yes, and I agree with you. There are a lot of good people out there that are just living under these conditions, and a lot of times they call for policies that actually hurt them. And I'd like to address the minimum wage. The minimum wage is an unemployment creator. The higher you raise it, the more unemployment you get. Could you imagine if the minimum wage was $50 an hour? How many people would get thrown out of work for that? But let's say it's even $15 an hour, and a young kid, he just can't earn $15 an hour. He doesn't have the skills. But he goes to an employer, he says, look, I'll sweep your floors all day long for $10 an hour. And the employer says, yeah, that's great, let's do it. But the government steps in and says, nope, can't do it. It has to be 15. So the kid is now out of work because his skills don't match what the government says. And then the welfare comes in and it just spirals downwards. So there's a lot of, there's an addiction to government in America, and that's really harming us.
And the other thing is the blame superficially that we hear so often is the fact that there's too much freedom, too much freedom to own a gun, and too much freedom for the corporations, and the corporations are all thought you can't have this profit incentives to motivate a system. So therefore, freedom is bad. The free market's horrible. And you can't have these problems being solved by voluntarism, which I think they're wrong on this, because they're looking at the same problem, but they're coming up with the conclusion that there's not enough government and there's too much freedom. And yet when you look at it, if you're looking at the reason for the wiping out of the middle class, you have to look to the government, because it's a predictable event. And it has to do with a monetary system which is biased toward the wealthy and the bankers, the military-industrial complex, deficit financing, the politicians, and all the people who are the middlemen in the medical system. We spend more money on education and medical care than any other country, and yet it doesn't seem to help either the patients or the students. So it's an attack in the wrong places. You can't attack freedom for corporatism and crony capitalism and inflationism. And if you want to look at something that has the most socialized issue in this country today has to do with money. And now we hear a lot of noise, we have to socialize everything. But the socialization of money, which means the Federal Reserve control to create money out of thin air, and then the worst part of socialism is price fixing. If you fix prices by a bureaucrat, believe me, it won't work, and you end up with Venezuela. But that's what the Federal Reserve is all about, is price fixing of money. Deciding what the control of money be, the supply of money, and who gets it, and what the price should be. Should the interest rates be 21%, which would happen in my lifetime, or should it be 0 or minus 0 when you count real inflation rate? So that is what a monopoly control does, and it destroys the middle class, and you impoverish people, and then that's a little bit more than people want to understand. It's much easier to say and believe what the radical left once and say, well, you have been messed up, you have been cheated, and therefore you have to be violent, you have to demand it. And that's what we hear so much about, is the violence to take advantage of this situation. So Chris, you might finish up by just commenting on the fact of which way we should go, because I don't think there's any doubt in my mind which way we should go.
Yes, this all starts with our mentality towards government, where people are hooked on, if there's a problem, government has to come in and solve it. But they will not solve it. They'll create more. And I'll point out one quick one because it's fresh on our minds. President Trump instituted tariffs, which are a tax on Americans. So now we have a tax, higher prices, and now there's a bailout for farmers. So we're getting taxed for two things now. They don't solve the first problem, but they create more. This has to be reversed.
And there's one thing that is very much present in a situation like this, and it's always bewildered me. How can people be so ruthless? How can they be so desperate that they can shoot somebody in cold blood? Sometimes they go in and then rob a store for $10 worth of goods, and then somebody's lying on the floor and they just shoot them and kill them, and they're so cold-blooded. And I keep thinking, in this whole system of what's going on today and the gang warfare and everything, I think one of the most important things is the loss of self-worth. They don't have any value in themselves. I used to think it was always, they don't care about the value of this other person's life, and therefore they will destroy it. No, I think it also incorporates, my life isn't worth anything, so what's the difference if I go out and do this? And I think that has a lot to do with something that government can't correct. It has a lot to do with the family and spiritual beliefs about the value of human life. But you have to have a sense of self-worth and satisfaction of doing something worthwhile and being productive. Without that, then the other person's life becomes worthless. And then when the government compounds this with an economic social system, then you end up with a Chicago. But unfortunately, I think the Chicago events are going to last. I think there's a lot of problems, economic problems that can't be solved overnight. There's too many false beliefs there. But I think it's going to take a while. But I still think the obligation that we have, who believe in freedom, is to explain why a free society and a society that defends sound money and free market principles and voluntarism is what we need. We don't need more government. want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.